we'll move along to Konrad Schmid, who is professor of Old Testament Studies and Early Judaism at the University of Zurich, Switzerland, formerly of Heidelberg, and currently a fellow of the Israel Institute of Advanced Studies at the Hebrew University. So please welcome Konrad Schmid.
Don't take this one. That's right.
Ladies and gentlemen, my paper is related to my current involvement in a year-long research group at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Jerusalem, which is devoted to the topic Convergence and Divergence in Pentateuchal Theory, bridging the academic cultures of Israel, North America, and Europe. It grew out of a conference in 2010 in Zurich, the results of which have been published in 2011. Our starting point of this project was the observation that Pentateuchal research in Israel, North America, and Europe differs widely in terms of presuppositions, methods, and results. We are nearly at the end of our year in Jerusalem, and I can tell you that our main accomplishment does not lie in a common understanding of the literary sources and redactions or their historical dates that could serve as a basis for future research. Rather, we have gotten a more precise understanding of our differences. We found out that we actually agree on very few points, and these basically pertain to four elements. First, the Pentateuch is a composite text. Second, the Pentateuch is, as a literary entity, a product of the first millennium, BCE. Third, the composition of the Pentateuch cannot be sufficiently explained without the assumption of sources. And by source, I mean a self-contained literary piece that once existed unto itself. And fourth, among the alleged sources, there is one textual layer that is less controversial than others, which is P, the so-called priestly document. Let me briefly comment on the last two of these 4 points. Regarding P, the agreements pertain more to its literary delineation than to its date. Scholars often argue for a Neo-Babylonian or early Persian origin, but especially in Israel, it's common to view P as a pre-exilic text, a conclusion that is also shared by many American scholars. Regarding the theory that there are earlier sources included the Pentateuch, scholars often identify a great divide between documentarians on the one side and supplementarians on the other one, referring thereby to the proponents of the documentary hypothesis located mainly in North America and Israel, and on the one hand, and the primarily European scholars who envision a more complex Genesis of the Pentateuch on the other hand. However, I am very uncomfortable with the nomenclature of this distinction. Why? The difference between the documentary hypothesis and more recent European approaches arising in the wake of Rentorf and Blum does not lie in the question whether or not one reckons with independent documents that have been incorporated in the Pentateuch. The difference between the two positions is with how many and which kind of documents we reckon, and how the process of their compilation and redactional expansion is to be reconstructed. The documentarians limit themselves often to 3 or including the 4 sources, and 1 or more generally mechanical redactors who basically compiled these texts. The so-called non-documentarians reckon with more sources, for example, P, the primeval history, the Abraham cycle, the Jacob cycle, the Joseph story, the Exodus story. This approach also assigns usually more text to redactional layers in the Pentateuch that compiled and updated the different source texts. One very basic and important commonality of these non-documentary approaches regarding our conference topic is that the Exodus story was neither from the beginning nor from the early periods of biblical literature merely one episode within a much larger story spanning from the patriarchs or even the creation to the death of Moses or the conquest of the land. It enjoyed a significant existence as a literary entity unto itself. Only for P, we do have clear evidence that the Exodus is merely the second act in Israel's foundational history, as I try to argue in my book Genesis and the Moses story, building on Thomas Römer's Israel's Väter and an article by Albert de Pury. It is, however, important to see that the divergencies in global Pentateuchal scholarship are not just the result of different assessments of individual texts within an otherwise shared approach to the Pentateuch. The differences arise from divergent understandings about how to do historical exegesis. For instance, how does one assess the degree of dependence of a biblical author on its historical and cultural contexts? How is one to evaluate literary discontinuities and continuities in ancient narrative texts? Or how should one conceive of ancient authors' imaginations and creativities? Of course, all these questions cannot be decided more geometrico. Nevertheless, there is still a great need for a discussion of such problems in a historically informed way. I have written my paper especially with this situation in mind. In order to make progress in Pentateuchal research in global terms, I think it is necessary to be both very cautious and very transparent in terms of methodology and basic presuppositions. And therefore, my paper will just address some foundational methodological considerations and their relevance for the alleged P layer in Exodus, and so I'm downsizing a little bit what I have promised in my abstract. I'll comment more on the non-P material in the written version of my paper. My methodological consideration pertains to a fundamental differentiation in biblical studies that, while very important, has not always been respected sufficiently. When interpreting the Bible historically, and this is especially true for the Pentateuch because its stories are at least history-like, it is crucial to acknowledge the difference between the world of the narratives and in the Bible and the world of the narrators, and to account for this difference in a methodologically controlled manner. Let me illustrate this point with a non-biblical sample from my home country, Switzerland. In 1804, Friedrich Schiller published a play by the name Wilhelm Tell, who is seen as one of the founding heroes of Switzerland from the 13th century. The world of this narrative is, accordingly, the early Middle Ages, the 13th century. The world of its author is the early 19th century. Of course, it is not impossible that this play about Wilhelm Tell reworks and includes some historical adequate memories from the 13th century. One could perhaps argue this on the basis of a number of historical observations, but it's much more likely and likewise to demonstrate that this play reflects foremost the time of Schiller himself, the 19th century. To identify historical elements in such a history-like story pertaining to the world of its authors is a complicated and demanding task. It also depends considerably upon the specific nature of the narrative itself. The best results are attained when certain elements appear in the story that cannot be explained fully within its narrative plot, seeming instead to resonate with the author's own historical and cultural context. If we discuss the Exodus story from such a perspective, then the starting point must be to account for this difference. The narrative of the Exodus story plays out in the second half of the second millennium BCE. This is the world of the narrative. The world of the narrators of the book of the Exodus story is, as virtually all scholars agree, not identical with the world of the narrative. Yet it's a matter of dispute how distant and how different the world of the narrators is from the world of the narrative. In addition, it's also probably safe to say that there are several distances between the different world of narrators from the world of the narrative, which vice versa also makes the notion of the world of the narrative more complicated. In terms of methodology, it is very important to avoid relating the world of the narrative to the world of the narrators in a simplistic, allegorical way. For example, the motive of the oppression and the corvée labor in Egypt is only a projection of Neo-Assyrian practices, or the exodus from Egypt is only a camouflage for the exodus from Babylonia. To be sure, the assertion of these historical backgrounds is possible and to a certain extent even probable, but there are at least two additional considerations that need to be taken into account. Firstly and foremost, each literary text develops its own fictive universe, which itself includes various indispensable elements. Secondly, a foundational myth, such as the Exodus story, is likely to have reworked a very complex set of memories and traditions. Therefore, the biblical Exodus account is not just a text to be decoded through the reconstruction of experiences from another later time. It should also be evaluated in terms of a literary text that has been shaped by, I make this assertion with caution, both earlier historical memories, maybe even into the world of the narrative itself, and contemporaneous influences of the world of the narrators. Given the current state of scholarship, the best approach to start gaining a historically adequate interpretation of the Exodus story is to discuss and evaluate the literary layer that is the least contested, the priestly version of the Exodus story. This layer has also received considerable scholarly attention. There is even a monograph from Peter Weimar and a recent article by Thomas Römer. A new approach has recently been presented by Christoph Berner. He argues that the P-texts in Exodus are not part of a source, but are of redactional nature. We will have time to discuss this tomorrow. Jakob Wörle is arguing for something similar for the patriarchal story. The priestly version of the Exodus story is usually considered to be made up out of the verses you see on the slide. It includes the basic elements of the oppression of the Israelites in Egypt, the commissioning of Moses, the contest with the Egyptian magicians, the setting up of the Pesach, Israel's departure from Egypt, and the death of Pharaoh and his army in the sea. Apparently, this narrative is about the early history of Israel. But as Norbert Lofink and Axel Knauf in particular have pointed out, it is less helpful to approach the priestly document, including its Exodus story, as a historiographical work. Rather, the priestly document intends to present Israel's beginnings not in terms of history, but in terms of a foundational myth. It's easier to describe this difference in German terms. P as a whole does not write Geschichte, but Urgeschichte. The importance of this differentiation will become clear in a minute. In what follows, I want to discuss 3 textual elements within P about which one might suspect that P's narrative world opens up a window into the specific historical world of its narrators. The first one is the decidedly anti-Egyptian stance of the narrative and its emphasis on divine violence against the Egyptians. It appears most poignantly in Exodus 14:28a, one of the final sentences of the description of the crossing of the sea. The Egyptians are buried in the sea after the Israelites have safely reached the opposite shore. The specific manner in which this act is described reveals its specific significance for P. The wording of Exodus 14 leaves no doubt that P does not base the salvation of Israel and the destruction of Egypt on an arbitrary act of God. Both elements are instead divine creational activities. This may be demonstrated first by Exodus 14:22. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground. In the crossing of the sea, the Israelites went on dry ground, Yabashah. The term Yabashah only appears once in the priestly document before Exodus 14:22. This is the statement in Genesis 1:9 in the priestly account of the creation. In the miracle at the Sea of Reeds, something similar to the third day of creation happens. The dry ground can be seen. Apparently, the priestly document intends the presentation of this miracle to take on the same mold as the creational activity of God during the very first days of creation. The wording of Exodus 14:20a shows a similar affiliation with God's creational activity reported at the very beginning of the world history. Within the priestly narrative, this statement of the covering of the waters of the chariots is quite similar in literary terms to the covering of the earth by the waters of the flood in Genesis 7:19-20. The implicit theological argument underlying this thematic and terminological link can be described as follows. The destruction of the Egyptian army in the sea is tantamount to the eradication of the sinful creatures during the flood. Erasing the Egyptian army is thus another element of the establishment of God's creational world order. These observations shows why P is more Urgeschichte than Geschichte. Why is the destruction of Egypt's military power now noteworthy? Outside of this episode, P projects otherwise a very peaceful world view. Within this overall peaceful worldview of P, the case of Egypt, especially the destruction of Egypt's military power at the crossing of the sea, is a striking exception. Why? I can see a sufficient basis for this motivation solely within the narrative world of P's Exodus account itself. P is ultimately interested in the establishment of the sanctuary. The destruction of Egypt at the crossing of the sea is not really necessary for such a narrative development. I am therefore inclined to follow a proposal put forth by Albert de Pury, who suggests that the violence towards Egypt might have arisen in regard to the specific constellation of the world of P's authors. I am aware that at this point I'm stepping into a contested debate regarding a possible date for P. For the time being, I just follow 2 basic arguments put forth by Wellhausen, which to my mind are still valid today. P presupposes the cult centralization of Deuteronomy, which can be dated to the Josianic period, and the classical prophets do not presuppose the legislation of P. There is, however, also some need to point out a specific shortcoming in Wellhausen's understanding and argument. His arguments were overly focused on the internal intellectual developments in ancient Israel and Judah. Especially the last decades from now have shown that ancient Israel and Judah's intellectual history is heavily influenced by the imperial ideologies of the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, and sometimes even the Greeks. P, for example, seems to respond to basic conceptions from the Persian worldview and political theology, chief among them being the peaceful, well-ordered organization of the world according to different nations, all of which dwell in their lands with their own language and culture. This is, for instance, reflected in P's share of the Table of Nations in Genesis 10. It has often been argued that one of the closest parallels to the basic idea of Genesis 10 is found in Persian imperial ideology, as attested, for example, in the Behistun inscription, which was disseminated widely throughout the Persian Empire. According to its political ideology, the Persian Empire was structured according to the different nations. The imperial inscriptions declare that every nation belongs to their specific region. Therefore, the picture of Egypt in P as a nation to be tamed in an otherwise well-organized and disciplined world might suggest that P predates 525 BCE, the date of the Persian conquest of Egypt by Cambyses. P seems to reflect the peaceful world order of the Persian Empire at a point in time that it includes the whole ancient world, except for Egypt. This constellation in the world of peace authors might also explain why the divine violence against Egypt seemed to be more directed towards its army than it is towards its population. There is, secondly, another striking element in this regard in P that pertains to the depiction of Egyptian religion in P. In Exodus 12:12, God tells Moses, "On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments." This is the only instance in P where Elohim denotes a plurality of deities and where deities other than Yahweh himself are envisioned. P is a decidedly monotheistic text propagating a sophisticated version of inclusive monotheism that reflects the empirical diversity of different religions in the world, that are, however, all transparent guideposts pointing to the one creator deity that is ultimately presented in the narrative flow of P as Yahweh. Bill Propp has drawn attention to the fact that Exodus 12:12 is formulated as an imperfect. I will punish. This precludes the possibility that Exodus 12:12 is referring back to the humiliation of the Egyptian gods in the plague cycle that has already taken place. Exodus 12:12 is apparently a narrative element that is not fully integrated into the world of the narrative, but again provides a window into the world of the narrator. Thirdly and finally, I would like to mention P's introduction of the figure of Moses in its Exodus account, which also seems to be influenced by the specific world of the author, especially when compared with its predecessor traditions in Exodus 1. Within the P narrative, Moses shows up somewhat surprisingly within the report of his commissioning in Egypt in Exodus 6. He is more probably introduced by the representation of his ancestry in Exodus 6:16 through 20, especially verse 20. And Amram took Yocheved, his aunt, for him as wife. She bore him Aaron and Moses. Three elements are striking in this introduction. Firstly, we are being told that Moses' father married his aunt. Secondly, Moses has an older brother, Aaron. Thirdly, we do not hear a word about Moses' miraculous salvation at his birth, which appears in the non-priestly account in Exodus 2. This third point is especially noteworthy because we can assume quite safely that Exodus 6:20 is acquainted with and reworks Exodus 2, given the somewhat difficult relationship between Moses' parents in terms of their kinship, which according to Leviticus 18 and 19 is illegitimate. This can be explained best by taking into account the introduction of Moses' birth story in Exodus 2. A man from the house of Levi went and took the daughter of Levi. This verse poses many problems that I cannot deal here with, but it seems obvious that Exodus 6:20 interprets the description of Moses' fathers in Exodus 2, a man from the house of Levi, as someone who is at least a grandson of Levi, whereas Moses' mother, the daughter of Levi, seems to be a direct daughter of Levi, therefore making Moses' parents thus nephew and aunt. If we can reasonably assume that Exodus 6:20 is acquainted with and reworks Exodus 2:1, then it is possible to go a step further in comparing both texts. They are quite similar to each other, but Exodus 6:20 introduces some transformations. The most important ones are the following. First, Moses' parents bear names, Amram and Jochebed. Second, their kinship is explicitly defined as nephew and aunt. Third, they are explicitly married. Moses' nameless father in Exodus 2 took the daughter of Levi, but Amram in Exodus 6 took Jochebed for him as wife. And fourth, Moses has an elder brother, Aaron. And fifth, most importantly, Exodus 6 is completely silent about Moses' miraculous salvation. Regarding a possible window into the world of the author, especially points 4 and 5 are remarkable. The introduction of Aaron as elder brother is in Exodus 6 a fact that deprives Moses of the claim of being firstborn, as suggested in Exodus 2, is probably to be interpreted in line with P's general tendency to eliminate any connotations of Moses as an exceptional hero with extraordinary powers. P has a decidedly theocentric view of history, and Moses' task in Exodus is just to announce what God will do to Israel, as Exodus 6:6 clearly states. It's not Moses but God who leads Israel out of Egypt in P. Furthermore, the goal of the Exodus is not the conquest of the land, but the dwelling of God amidst his people. Moses in P is merely an agent of God whose primary task is to establish the sanctuary. This is possibly also the way the priestly authors perceived the Persian kings of their time. They are commissioned by God, and their task is to rebuild the temple. The ideal king, according to P, is only portrayed negatively. He is the opposite of the Pharaoh of the Exodus, who does not listen to Israel's God and hardens his heart. I come to my conclusions. I have a suspicion about the effects of what I have just presented. I was probably preaching either to the converted or in vain, depending on whether you agree that P is a Persian period text or not. To be sure, I do not preclude the possibility that P has reworked earlier material, especially in its legal parts. Nevertheless, I think that if we carefully distinguish between the world of the narrative and the world of the authors when evaluating biblical texts in historical terms, I think we can move some steps forward in global Pentateuchal research and its link with other historical disciplines. Thank you.